What we do find as part of the civil rights movement during this time is that women and mothers, specifically Black women and mothers, really became the backbone of the civil rights movement and kind of the group that was most consistently sort of left out of the dialogue. Observers consistently noted that Southern Black women formed the backbone of the movement and took the lead in the struggle for dignity, for their participation as bus boycotters of Montgomery, to their hosting of visiting Mississippi SNCC workers. Domestic workers assumed responsibility for the care and protection of the larger families. And they displayed courage daily, far from the glory and glamour of the civil rights hierarchy, while working in the homes of whites and sometimes being arrested and jailed. As Pramila Nadson sums up, domestic workers were much more than foot soldiers. They filled the pews at the weekly mass meetings and generated energy and enthusiasm for the boycott, and also exhibited leadership by raising money and mobilizing others in the community to support the campaign. So we have a lot of figures that come into the scenes and are the backbones in the scenes that we don't hear about, like Martin Luther King Jr., because they were sort of left out of these discourses, again, as Black women often do, unfortunately. Bolden's early experiences, Dorothy Lee Bolden, working as a maid during the late 1940s in Atlanta, initially inspired her civil rights activism. In one incident, her white female employer demanded that she stay and wash dishes even though her work hours were over. Bolden refused. She was arrested shortly after and was taken to county jail for psychiatric evaluation because she was seen as crazy for disobeying orders from a white person. She was never institutionalized, but this event inspired her to eventually create an organization to protect maids. And so she, although working on the side with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to confront police brutality, she also founded the National Domestic Workers Union of America in 1968 to help encourage sort of these issues that were going on, or not encourage, to change the issues that were going on with wages for Black women. She rode buses in Atlanta and heard about the working conditions of each individual domestic worker. And so she organized this national union that gave voice to domestic workers in that city. Also made sure that they received workman's compensation. The minimum wage had been $1.25 an hour, but maids earning average $3.50 to $5 a day for 12 to 14-hour shifts, and it continued to go up under this union. So they even worked in the 1970s, and we'll talk about that in a second here. She would also receive death threats as well because of the way that she was working to promote and encourage Black women and mothers. And she would also work the 1970s for the Nixon administration for the advisory committee to work with welfare rights and social services as well. Education for women, as well as Black children in general, was a big issue during this time as well because of segregation. We have some big figures in the 1930s and 40s, such as Mary McLeod Bethune, who developed Bethune-Cookman University, and founded the National Council of Negro Women, ending segregation and discrimination, and became the acknowledged First Lady of Negro America by Ebony Magazine. She was also part of the Black Cabinet for Roosevelt. Here she is with Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, on the right. She gave out faith to the people and encouraged them to get an education, and this became a big issue in the 50s and 60s. So Plessy versus Ferguson was one of those Supreme Court acts that upheld it was an 1896 case where it upheld the separate but equal segregation with foreseeing Homer Plessy, who was apparently 1/8 black to be forced into the other sections. He was sitting in the white only section, and it was upheld by Plessy versus Ferguson. But in the Sweat versus Painter in 1950, they were making a pledge to make a new standard for equality in graduate and law schools, as they sort of found out that, of course, they were not equal, in that they were still causing black schools to be poorer and less well-funded, where white schools were funded, which was against sort of this idea of separate but equal. And this also continued with Polly Myers Hudson and authoring Juanita Lucy, who were accepted into University of Alabama in 1952, and were accepted. And when the university discovered they were black, they took back this acceptance, and they took this to court. And so they did go to the school, but it was rescinded the year after when the president resigned of the college. But again, women continually trying to get into these universities and colleges to continue their educations at these better universities. And you could see this as well with very important court cases for children as well. In 1951, we have Linda Brown, who's an 8-year-old girl in Topeka, Kansas, who lived within walking distance of a whites-only elementary school, but because of segregation, she had to travel by bus to a more distant school for African-American children, and so her father sued the school board of Topeka, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear their case. So in 54, you have... Oh, this is her with her sister here. In 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that decreed finally that school segregation was unconstitutional, and yet the ruling was not enforced. So we still saw rampant segregation in schools as different mayors and governors tried to keep particular black children out of those schools. Daisy Bates was a really big part of this Supreme Court decision, and she was working with them, and she was the president of the NAACP in Arkansas, and she was working with her husband, and they started the newspaper called the Arkansas Weekly, which was solely dedicated to the civil rights movement, and she edited and also wrote for it. And after the ruling, Bates's paper would publicize schools who did not follow the mandate, even though she was constantly threatened. And the NAACP sued the Little Rock School Board, and in 1857, Bates and her husband recruited 9 students to integrate into the all-white Central High School there, and she would often regularly drive them to the school and protect them from violent crowds. Oh, I'm sorry, this is her Arkansas paper. I got ahead of myself here. So these are the 9 students here. I can list their names in the PowerPoint as well. But the Little Rock 9 were successfully able to integrate in the school under the protection of federal troops eventually, which I'll show you here shortly. And Bates's home served as the headquarters of this sort of protest. So there are a lot of famous photos from these moments of these 9 black children trying to integrate into this school, this high school. And the governor there, Orville E. Faubus, really was against school integration. And he used, I just lost my place, I'm sorry. He used the National Guard to block entry into this school. And when President Eisenhower heard this, he ordered federal troops to integrate the schools, and would also escort the children to school as well. So you can see even this Confederate flag here. But so while mayors and governors tried to keep the black children out of these schools, Eisenhower thankfully worked hard to get the federal troops there to make sure that they were able to be escorted to class. If you can imagine this scene here. So, unfortunately, eventually, well, actually, I should say this first. In 1958, the Supreme Court did have another ruling of Cooper versus Aaron, where it say that the rule that the threat of mob violence is not a reason enough to delay school desegregation. Um, and although Bates was sort of um, constantly threatened, she had to shut down her newspaper. She published a book in 1962 about this event in Little Rock that really changed a lot of people's lives and helped encourage desegregation. There were other figures as well, like 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who was part of this campaign, this sweet little girl. In 1956, the U.S. District Court Judge J. Skelly Wright ordered the desegregation of the New Orleans public schools, and set up a plan that required integration on a grade per year basis, beginning with the first grade. And the school board issued a test to Black kindergartners to determine the best candidates. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was one of the 6 children selected, and 4 agreed to proceed. On November 14th, she was integrated into the school. In retaliation, white parents withdrew their kids from the school, and even Ruby's father was fired from his job. And Ruby actually completed the first grade alone with the support of Barbara Henry, a Boston teacher, and Dr. Robert Coles, a child psychologist. And she had to be escorted by U.S. Marshals every day. So you can imagine this little girl going to school every day all alone for the first grade. That's quite, I mean, it's quite the traumatic first grade experience. But she was able to complete the first grade, which inspired the painting by Norman Rockwell. If you've seen this before, from 1964, The Problem We All Live With. There are a couple of important events in 1955 that really spur the larger civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Malcolm X, and one of them being, unfortunately, the death of Emmett Till in 1955, who was a 14-year-old black man black child, visiting relatives in a small Mississippi town, and he apparently whistled at a white woman, and she's actually come out, she's here far on the right, she actually came out and said that these events did not occur, that she claimed he grabbed her, and her husband and her half-brother, or his half-brother, I'm sorry, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, tortured Emmett Till, gouged his eyes out, beat him, and shot him through the head, then thrown him in the Tallahatchie River, in the gym mill, and then tied his neck with barbed wire. And so because of this horrific event, Emmett Till's mother decided sort of courageously or with this sort of fiery passion to show what had happened to her son. She had an open cast funeral so that people could see what happened to Emmett Till, to see the sort of event of these white men torturing this young black boy in 1955, which you've hopefully seen before. It's a very powerful and horrific image, unfortunately. These are the 2 men here, and they were acquitted of all charges in the court case. I think it took them like less than 45 minutes to deliberate or something, to that effect. And it did come out recently that these men were acquitted, and Breonna Taylor's murderers were also acquitted, and they were acquitted on the same day, 65 years apart. So you can see this continued sort of discrimination that has occurred. I will be including 2 songs here for you guys to listen to. If you took intro with me, you've probably heard them before. These 2 songs about Emmett Till. Well, actually, sorry. Bob Dylan's is about Emmett Till, but the one by Billie Holiday is just about lynching in general of young black men, which are really powerful songs. This place where Emmett Till's body has been marked for a long time as the river site. Recently it came out that these children were upset about it being there and said they wanted to forget about it. So these young white boys shot at this sign. I feel like I have the link in this PowerPoint, but maybe I don't. Yeah. Let's get this up here because I want to say what the quote is here. There was a lot of pushback not only from the white community but from the black community also, said James Dimming. Whites and blacks came to our meeting and said, "Why are you bringing this up? Why don't y'all let it die?" As you can imagine, and here's the kids that shot the sign down, that this continued discrimination is obviously a continued problem, not something that people are likely to forget and shouldn't forget. As John Lewis says, who's a very important part of the civil rights movement we're about to talk about, he said, "Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor." He recalls his own childhood in Alabama. The white supremacist threat was a fact of everyday life. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store from the Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. John Lewis being 15 years old at the time that Emmett Till was killed. So, almost the same age as Emmett Till, only 1 year apart. Now, the second action in 1955 that was very important against Emmett Till's, or sort of a foil for Emmett Till's, is Rosa Parks, as you most likely have heard the story for. With her act of defiance, she's often called the mother of the civil rights movement, as well as the first lady of the civil rights. She was a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, and an active member of her NAACP chapter. And as you may know, her and 3 other people were asked to move from the colored section of the bus, the colored for colored people, quote unquote, and she refused to do so, and they fined her $10 plus $4 in court fees and arrested her as well. Parks had trouble with this bus driver before, and it was sort of traditional that you would pay at the front of the bus and then go and enter in the section for black people only in the back, and he had driven off without letting her get back on the bus, knowing that she had paid before. So she had issues with this bus driver before. So this was not the first time that she had sort of dealt with him. So that's James F. Blake. And you can see the complaint here with him signing here as a witness. There's even a diagram because she took it to court, showing where she was sitting on the bus as well. Ironically enough, 9 months earlier, a 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested for the same act, but she was pregnant. And so the civil rights movement kind of wanted a symbol for this, wanted someone to be a symbol, wanted to use them as sort of a case to help the civil rights movement, which obviously Rosa Parks did. Because Colvin was pregnant, she wasn't considered the best individual to make sort of this hero figure out of. So instead, they would make Rosa Parks that figure. And so they tried to see her case through to the end, and it got kind of bogged up in court, and so she never did sort of be able to take it to the Supreme Court, but they did in all their efforts try to do so. But she went on, even though she was fired from her job as a seamstress, she would go on to work in government with figures like John Conyers, who was the first Black congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, if I remember, as well as to become an active member of the Black Power movement. I think I have a video here that has her talking.
Nightly Films is sponsored by Pfizer.
Justice won a year later when the Supreme Court struck down a law desegregating public buses. For Rosa Parks, it was a seat in the front of the bus. But because of threats and violence, she soon left Montgomery and moved to Detroit.
I am grateful that some progress has been made, and I am also concerned about the fact that there still remains the idea of white supremacy.
Rosa Parks tells us there's always something we can do. She tells us that we all have responsibilities to ourselves and to one another. She reminds us that this is how change happens. Not mainly through the exploits of the famous and the powerful, but through the countless acts of often anonymous courage and kindness and fellow feeling and responsibility that continually, stubbornly expand our conception of justice, our conception of what is possible. Rosa Parks' singular act of disobedience launched a movement. The tired feet of those who walked the dusty roads of Montgomery helped a nation see that to which it had once been blind. It is because of these men and women that I stand here today. It is because of them that our children grow up in a land more free and more fair, a land truer to its founding creed.
So by this time, Black citizens were boycotting the bus system to some extent, but this really launched a very large Montgomery bus boycott from December 5th of 1955 to December 20th of 1956. So a 381-day boycott of this system. And so it became this massive movement in Montgomery to fight against this sort of municipal abuse that was going on. And it was organized greatly by Martin Luther King Jr. And you saw these sort of droves of people walking in the streets and trying to get to work day in and day out without using the bus system. As you can imagine, that was a great sacrifice in a lot of people's lives. And they would hand out cards like this talking about how they are working to protest the bus system. And by and large, the buses were quite empty at this time. There's a lot of images that you can see where you just see sort of a couple white passengers here or there riding on the buses. The Women's Political Council, which was organized by active Black women in anti-segregation activities and politics, very much helped in the Montgomery bus boycott, like Joanne Gibson Robinson, who worked with figures like Mary Fair Burks to protest and try to get some information out there about the protesting, to the point that these educators were actually fired from their jobs at the Alabama State College. There are so many women that were part of these protests that didn't gain recognition, just like in all other parts of the civil rights movement. Like Georgia Gilmore is a really big figure from this boycott, and she was a mother and had this kind of fiery temper, according to her family members. And she got involved with the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, to help with the boycott. She had been, Gilmore's involvement in the boycott, along with her vocal contempt for discriminatory white bus drivers, resulted in her being fired from the National Lunch Company, but this only increased her participation within MIA, and Boycott later saying this new generation had decided that they had just taken as much as they could. So she founded the group Clubs from Nowhere, which was kind of this sort of ironic name for it, that saying that, like, where did you get this food from nowhere, where they would feed and fund the civil rights movement, believing that what they felt that they could do best was to cook. And they kept themselves anonymous and sustained the boycott through feeding them, through raising money for transportation and insurance and legal representation and security. So she became this massive figure that actually helped to push the bus boycott forward by doing all of these sort of grassroots feeding and financial aid. So she has like a book, a little children's book here that I stumbled upon, Pies from Nowhere, from 2018, which chronicles her acts of defiance. There were other protests as well, like the Freedom Riders, which occurred in 1961, in which civil rights activists rode interstate buses to challenge the non-enforcement of the desegregation of buses that was occurring during this time after Rosa Parks. And there was one event in which one of the buses was met with a mob. The mob followed the bus in automobiles, and when the tires on the bus blew out, someone threw a bomb into the bus. The Freedom Riders escaped the bus as it burst into flames, only to be brutally beaten by members of a surrounding mob. The second bus, a Trailways vehicle, traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, and those riders were also beaten by an angry white mob, many of whom brandished metal pipes. Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor stated that although he knew the Freedom Riders were arriving and violence awaited them, he posted no police protection at the station because it was Mother's Day. So knowing that this mob of 200 white citizens were going to attack the people on this bus, the police officers did nothing about it. And so they beat these individuals up in Alabama, including these famous figures. The one on the left may seem slightly familiar to you, or this one here up in the, I'm pointing with my finger, up in the top left corner here, who is John Lewis. He said, "We were determined not to let any act of violence keep us from our goal. We knew our lives could be threatened, but we had made up our minds not to turn back." So in 1956, when they had that decision to segregate the buses, to desegregate the buses, the Freedom Riders were fighting because that, in fact, was not upheld through the courts, as you can imagine. Two other female figures who are often not mentioned are Ruby Hurley, who was the NAACP executive and on the front lines of the modern civil rights movement, and she was a rare woman to hold senior leadership in the position of the National Civil Rights Organization, being part of the NAACP and launching different sit-in movements. It had about 25,000 youth members. Another one is Dorothy Height, who improved the circumstances and opportunities for African American women, and pressured President Eisenhower to more aggressively pursue school desegregation, and was the president of the National Council of Negro Women from 57 to 97. So she became really important and was known as the glue holding the top of the echelons of the civil rights leaders together. So these two figures are really not discussed frequently, but were really behind the scenes working on the bus boycotts, just like Georgia Gilmore as well.